Yeah, so thanks to everyone for being here for our second session in our 4-part series with LISC and the Smart Growth Alliance on affordable housing as a climate solution. And tonight we're going to be focusing on zoning as a critical pathway to achieve affordable housing as a climate solution. So just to give everyone a little bit of background for folks who don't know, I am Rebecca Wintrick-Knox. I work with the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, and MCAN was founded in 2000, and we really see ourselves as a learning network of chapters across the Commonwealth working to implement local clean energy solutions. So we have about 50 chapters representing over 100 cities and towns across Massachusetts, and we are a network of local groups that also work to create statewide clean energy policies and programs. Sorry, I'm hearing a lot of background noise, so if people could mute themselves, that would be great. Okay, sorry. So I have once again muted all participants. Once again, for our panelists, you should be able to unmute yourselves on the computer side panel. For everyone else, I would appreciate if you could stay muted for the rest of the session. And we'll do some moderated Q&A at the end, so you can drop questions in the chat box. So just to continue with some context setting, as everyone on this call knows, climate change is happening, and its impacts in Massachusetts are really severe and drastic. But we really believe as a group of organizers that local action is the solution to a lot of the problems that we're facing. And we've seen in the past time and time again that local action is really the best way to get things done on climate. That if we wait for our state and federal decision makers to take action, we're going to be waiting for a long time. But when we work together as communities, we can really get stuff done and make progressive change happen. And the good news is that we have the tools. As we're going to hear tonight from our expert panelists, we have plenty of tools that we can implement to create more affordable housing, climate-friendly housing, using zoning as one of these tools. So I just want to briefly introduce our 3 panelists tonight. First of all, we're going to be hearing from Karina Milchman, who is the Chief of Housing and Neighborhood Development at MAPC. And Karina is going to give us some context setting on why affordable housing is part of the climate solution. And then we're going to hear from Andre LaRue, who is the Executive Director at the Mass Smart Growth Alliance. I'm sorry, he's actually going to close us out by talking about zoning strategies that communities can adopt to create more climate-friendly, affordable housing. Between Karina and Andre, we're going to hear from Shelley Goring, who is going to talk about how we can strive for inclusionary rather than exclusionary zoning practices to create affordable housing. And then, like I said, we'll have about 15 minutes of moderated Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat box as they occur to you. And just a quick housekeeping note, please don't try and answer other people's questions because it can be a bit distracting. So we will do that at the end. So Karina, if you're able to unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here and to be heard, hopefully. As mentioned, my name is Karina Milchman. I am the head of Housing and Neighborhood Development at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Just a little bit about MAPC. We're a quasi-government agency. We're mission-based. We're dedicated to promoting smart growth and regional collaboration. My team specifically is committed to expanding and diversifying housing across greater Weston. So MAPC is the largest RPA in Massachusetts. Rebecca, you can go to the next slide. We serve 101 cities and towns, greater Boston, essentially everyone inside 495. As you can see, it's the gray shaded area. Next slide. Our region is lucky. We're well served by transit. Oh, sorry, if you could go back to this one. Sorry. Yeah. We've got a good transit system, notwithstanding the MBTA's latest infrastructure and funding challenges. You can see the T and the commuter rails cover most of our communities. Next slide. But we're also a region experiencing a housing affordability crisis, and that's stemming from high demand and limited supply. Our population is increasing. We have a booming regional economy, and jobs are drawing people. Between 2010 and 17, we added 245,000 new jobs, but we only added 71,600 new homes. Rebecca, if you could click the slide, please. You can click it again. This pent-up demand has contributed to soaring housing prices, now some of the highest in the nation. Rents in Greater Boston, the median is over $2,300 a month as of this summer. You can click the next one. The median sale price that same time period for a condo was over $580,000, and for a single-family home, if you click the next one, is $655,000 median. So this is tough for a lot of residents. They're struggling, and we have 37% of households in our region are cost burden, which means they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And according to federal standards, this is a threshold for concern. Anything over 30%, folks have to make tough choices between housing costs, transit costs, health care, food, and so forth. They also have less discretionary spending to support local businesses. So it puts a lot of pressure on residents and their communities. Next slide. So MAPC, as the regional planning agency, also puts together projections for the future. And regarding housing, I can say there's a lot of unmet housing demand. For our entire region, we need an additional 435,000 homes by 2040. And for the innermost communities, you can see them in blue, we need 185,000 of those homes by 2030. So that's a subset of the 435,000 total. But it's a lot of housing. And all of our communities need to do their part, but we really want to concentrate new housing in smart growth areas, particularly near transit, so as not to repeat some of the mistakes of the past. Next slide. And speaking of, when we hear sprawl, we usually picture this. In Massachusetts, it often looks like this, if you click to the next one, Rebecca, or the next one even. And it leads to a lot of this, if you click to the next one. Essentially, sprawl means development that is spread out, it's lower density, it's characterized by large lots, big single-family homes, and often ownership rather than rental housing. And this kind of land use pattern is often the result of what we call exclusive zoning, which is often designed to keep certain kinds of people out of communities, namely lower income folks, African American folks who can't afford this kind of housing. And Shelley's going to talk about this more in a little bit. But these car-dependent bedroom communities have negative environmental consequences as well. Their residents commute into job centers sometimes as much as 1, 2, I've heard stories of even 3 hours a day. Next slide. Meanwhile, a lot of what we like most about some of our historic communities here in Massachusetts isn't allowed by current zoning. You can see here a range of housing types, smaller homes, denser development patterns with smaller lots and modest setbacks, mid-scale multifamily housing types. Often this kind of housing is referred to as naturally affordable because it's smaller in size, some of the buildings share a party wall and so forth. But this kind of stock is increasing in cost lately across our region as demand for housing rises and production is slow to respond. It's also not frequently being developed anymore due to restrictive zoning, as well as the high cost of developing at a more moderate scale. So the existing kind of naturally occurring affordable housing supply is not only not being added to, but it's also shrinking, not just because of rising costs, but also because a lot of these homes are being flipped and sold as luxury or torn down to make way for larger homes. Next slide. In places that are suitable for higher density development, particularly around station areas, often don't have zoning that allows for that kind of development. no multifamily zoning, no zoning for mixed-use development, no inclusionary zoning, which requires market rate developers to set aside a portion of new units in a project as deed-restricted affordable housing for income-eligible households, usually low or moderate income households. So some of our communities are trying to change this, which is great, but there's a lot of opposition. You can click to the next slide, please. These are just some recent headlines to illustrate the point. Rebecca, you can just keep going. There's been significant pushback, as I mentioned, because people tend to like the status quo. They fear development impacts, changes to the built environment, the character of their built environment, impacts in terms of traffic maybe, school impacts, and often there's just bias against folks who want to live in multifamily housing or need affordable housing. Next slide. But we have good reason to try to change things despite the opposition and the challenges. We can meet the need for more housing and more affordable housing, and at the same time mitigate climate change, climate impacts through smart planning and development. And I would say as a first strategy, we should concentrate housing near jobs and services to create more walkable communities. This will limit sprawl and greenfield development in favor of infill and enable residents to drive less, either because they're making shorter trips or they're shifting their trips to transit. Secondly, I think it's important that lower income households have the opportunity to live in these neighborhoods. They tend to be more transit dependent. Studies show that wealthier residents, even those who live near transit, often drive more miles and own more cars than lower income residents. And another aspect I would say is that multifamily development tends to be more energy efficient. It has shared walls, sometimes shared energy systems. It can be built to meet passive house standards in a way that single-family housing just cannot. Next slide. And as I said, I think it's very important that this kind of development, modest incomes, in order to be an effective climate strategy. But lower income transit dependent residents are being pushed farther and farther from neighborhoods and communities with jobs in transit as the cost of housing in these neighborhoods soar due to the unmet demand, and specifically unmet demand from higher income households who can really bid up the cost of housing. So without affordable housing in these transit-rich neighborhoods, we'll see increased use of single occupancy vehicles, both from wealthier residents in those neighborhoods who don't rely on transit, and also from lower income residents who are pushed into less expensive suburbs without transit and have no other choice in terms of transit modes. So we need to ensure that lower income households are not displaced from these transit accessible neighborhoods. Next slide. And at the same time, the suburbs that benefit from having commuter rail really need to do their part to meet affordable housing need in the region, and by doing so ensure that their rail is well used and car commuting can perhaps decline. So despite resident opposition to this kind of change, I think leaders in these communities really must identify areas that make sense for housing of different types and deed-restricted affordable housing specifically, to both expand opportunity for a range of households and mitigate the climate impacts of a growing population. And there's just a few examples of some successes here in the MAPC region. And that's all I have for context.
Thank you so much, Karina. Yeah, that was great. And just a heads up, everyone, you are now muted again, except for our panelists. Apologies for those technical delays, and Karina, you gave an incredible presentation. Shelley, are you able to join us?
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, great. So should I get started?
Go for it.
So my name is Shelley, and I work at MHP, Mass Housing Partnership. We are a quasi-state agency in Massachusetts that's focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing across the state, and we do that in a variety of ways, but I work on the community assistance team. And we spend a lot of time in communities all across the state helping to build local leadership and capacity to support affordable housing in municipalities. And we do quite a bit of work around fair housing, the federal fair housing law, what that means in our communities. And this last year we've been exploring exclusionary zoning and how that impacts people's access to our communities. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit this evening. So you can go to the next slide. So this is an 1884 map of Arlington, Massachusetts. The inset in the top right, you can just see where Arlington is in relation to Boston if you're not quite familiar. It's about 9 miles from Arlington's town hall to Boston's city hall, just to give you a sense of the distance. It's pretty close. So this is an 1884 map, and what you may notice is that the community is developing densely along main thoroughfares. The east-west street is Mass Ave, and what is now Route 60 is coming down in the front, south, heading south. And then Route 3 is north and kind of veers off into the east a little bit. If you could read the little itty-bitty words, you would see that not only is it developing densely and along main thoroughfares, but it's also being built out in a mixed-use fashion. So factories and small businesses are in walking distance of houses and municipal buildings, schools, libraries, etc. So it's dense, it's mixed use, and it's walkable. And this really is the historic character of New England. This is essentially how all of our have, and you may see the railroad as well. And of course, the train is partly what spurred investment in development allowed us to grow. Next slide. This is a 1938 redlining map of Arlington. You may be familiar with the practice of redlining, but the federal government created this policy to determine where we would invest public dollars in underwriting mortgages and where we wouldn't. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was a federal agency that created these maps of communities all across the country. And on their legend, you can see that green is the best. These are the best neighborhoods. Blue are still desirable neighborhoods. Yellow is declining, and red is hazardous. So in 1938, Arlington did not have a red community. There's a tip at the very bottom of the map that's red because Belmont did have a section of the neighborhood that was identified as hazardous. But the green, the best neighborhoods were affluent, white communities, highly educated. The blue are similar, but perhaps a little bit lower economic status. And red oftentimes had people of color, specifically African-American people living in the neighborhood. When I saw this map for Arlington, I thought it was interesting that C2, right along Mass Ave, that this was identified as declining. And because these maps are now, they've been uploaded and you can interact with them, you can click on the particular district and it will take you to the report that went along with the map. So I clicked on C2 and I came to some of the information on the next slide. So under C2, the report says that for area characteristics, under detrimental influences, it uses the language obsolescence, business and housing mixed together, railroad tracks through the neighborhood. So the characteristics of this district in the 1880s that made that a thriving community that helped Arlington grow, where everything really was happening in the community. By the 1930s, this was seen as detrimental. These were seen as negative traits in the neighborhood. So by the 1930s, our idea of land use had dramatically changed and no longer reflected a more historic perspective of land use in New England. This report said the trend of desirability over the next 10 to 15 years was down. For inhabitants, they identified occupation as clerks and laborers, so more lower income, estimated annual family income, $1,500 to $2,500, and then their foreign-born families, it was Italian. So oftentimes in neighborhoods that were identified as declining, there were immigrants that were moving into the neighborhood, and that was seen as a negative. When you see Italian reports like this, we also have to keep in mind that Italian immigrants were oftentimes Catholic, and there was quite a bit of discrimination against Catholic households in the United States, and then infiltration of lower class. And in this section of the report, the only race group that's called out are African American. So those filling out the report were required or called to list the percentage of African Americans that lived in that neighborhood. And then clarifying remarks, there's little possibility of conversion of properties to business use. So again, it's underlining that there was little chance that it would become a single-use district. Next slide. This is a modern map of Arlington. So the very colorful strip down the middle, that's Mass Ave. You can see, if you were able to read the legend really well, you'd see that it allows for a variety of different uses. And there are sections in Arlington where they allow for multifamily housing. The mustard color on the in the east part of Arlington, those are two-family districts. But the very light pale yellow and the brighter yellow in the north end of the community, all that area, the majority of the land has been cut up into single-family detached housing zones. So it does allow for some mixed use on the map, but the majority has been cut up into large lots, primarily larger single lots. So the next slide. So while the map appears to allow for some denser development, the reality is that the bureaucracy, the boards that have a say in development review, the process has become so arduous that one real estate attorney in Arlington has suggested that many only develop in Arlington once. And unfortunately, this isn't unusual sentiment in a lot of our communities. And unfortunately, that in some communities, that's really actually the goal. Next slide. Then turning to Weston. So you can see Weston is just west of Boston. It's about 15 miles from Weston's Town Hall to Boston's City Hall. Weston has 3 commuter rail stops on the Fitchburg line. So these are historic stops. It has incredible access to roads, to the Turnpike, to 95, to Route 20, 30, 117. Almost a fifth of their land is in public forests, conservation, and parks, and much of the privately owned land is open space as well. And despite being only 15 miles from Boston, they have 0 sewer in the community. And when you look at this, you may be tempted to think that Weston has always been just kind of this bedroom community and very rural and just residential. But the reality is that because of some of these key routes that went through Weston, Route 20 was a key path from Boston to New York. 117 was key from Boston to Vermont. So because of that, then businesses actually opened up along these routes to serve the transportation that was going through Weston historically. And next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. And in the late 19th century, an organ factory also opened up. Mr. Hastings had learned the business from an organ factory in the Roxbury section of Boston, and he eventually became a part owner, and then he became the owner. And at that point, he moved the factory to land that had been in his family for generations in Weston. And this was near the Stony Brook, near the railroad, along 117. And on the left, you can see the factory, and it was a pretty substantial building, 4 stories, and the wings were each 100 feet long. He built himself a house within walking distance to the factory, and on the right-hand side, because his workers didn't want to have to come out from Boston on the train, they wanted to live in the community, he actually initially built worker housing. So on the right-hand side, you see images of worker housing. He helped initially build some of the worker housing, and then in subsequent years, he helped his workers to build their houses so that they could live close by, they could walk. And that was pretty common as well in New England with factory owners and mill owners, that they had their house, they had the mill or the factory and worker housing all within walking distance of each other. Next slide. But this is a current zoning map of Weston, the north part of Weston. And I put the commuter rail stations, the Silver Hill, Hastings, and Kendall Green on the map. And then you see the lot size in Weston today. The dark green is the smallest lot size in Weston, 20,000 square feet or 0.46 acres, so almost a half an acre is the minimum lot size. And the bright green is the 30,000 square feet. The light green is 40,000. The majority of Weston is zoned at 60,000 square feet or 1.37 acres per unit of housing. So you see around the stations that they do not allow for very much density. In fact, very few houses can be built up around those commuter rail stops. So on the next slide, it's not surprising that in 2018, 2 of those 3 stations were on the MBTA's 10 least utilized stations in the entire MBTA commuter rail system. The Silver Hill had an average of 21 riders a day in 2018, and Hastings had an average of 42 riders a day in 2018. And even if Silver Hill still had the 101 that they had in 2012, it still would have been on the top 10 least utilized stations. So when you don't allow development around the stations, it's not surprising that ridership is very low. The next slide. Our organization is doing quite a bit of work of looking at land use around commuter rail stations. And so this is just a glimpse looking at Kendall Green, which is the last station in Weston, and then the very next station in Waltham. And you see that, so the circles are a half mile around the stations. And in Weston, because the 2 stations, Hastings and Kendall Green, are so close, then they split the difference between those 2 stations. So the Weston map has 179 units of housing within that circle around the Kendall Green station. In comparison, Waltham station has almost 5,000 units of housing. And then in Weston, that comes out to a density of 0.6 units per acre. And on the Waltham side, you see that it's 11.2 units per acre. And so I would just point out that we take the green space in these circles out of the denominator. So in Weston, if you added in the green space, it would actually be fewer units per acre than it is. And our numbers so far suggest that if around a half acre around all the commuter rail stations allowed for just 10 units per acre, that we could add 200,000 units of housing around the commuter rails to make them a bit more built up so that more people could actually walk to the station instead of having to drive. Next slide. Unfortunately, in this country, there have been a variety of ways that we have discriminated against people. In the early years of zoning, communities actually zoned by race. In 1917, the Supreme Court outlawed this in Buchanan versus Worley. It just meant that communities then turned to a different way to keep people out based on race. They used racial covenants on individual units of housing that didn't allow the house to be sold or rented to people of color. And then this was outlawed in 1948 in Shelley versus Kramer. In 1968, we passed the Federal Fair Housing Act that outlawed redlining and a variety of discriminative behaviors, but unfortunately, exclusionary zoning is one way that this exclusion of people persists in our communities. Next slide. In 2015, the Supreme Court case, Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project, Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion, and in it he says these unlawful practices include zoning laws and other housing restrictions that function unfairly to exclude minorities from certain neighborhoods without any sufficient justification. And he says that suits targeting such practices reside at the heartland of disparate impact liability. So the Supreme Court in 2015 was reaffirming this idea of disparate impact, that it's not just our intent to discriminate, but it's also the impact. If the impact of our practices and policies are discriminative. That's seen as disparate impact. It's seen as a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Next slide. And some people will say, well, exclusionary zoning is excluding people based on class. It's just making the neighborhoods, the communities more expensive, and technically class is not protected with the Fair Housing Act. So the Federal Fair Housing Act on the left, those 7 categories are protected classes. On the right is the state's anti-discrimination law, and so technically class is not a protected class in either of those. But next slide. We know that class has racial implications. Next slide. So one study out of Brandeis followed dozens of households for 25 years, and they found that homeownership and the length of time owning a home was the single biggest contributor to the racial wealth gap in the United States, that it contributed 27% to the racial wealth gap, and the difference in incomes contributed 20%. Next slide. And yet, despite that, there have been many policies that have prioritized white households being able to access homeownership over households of color. The Homestead Act in the 1860s, 1800s was the largest transfer of public land to private hands. Primarily those who benefited were prospectors and white European immigrants. FHA had the redlining where white households were prioritized for access to mortgages. The GI Bill after World War II, it was passed with a negotiation with the South that it would be implemented on the state level, which meant that it was implemented under Jim Crow. And one of the biggest benefits for white GIs was access to homeownership that was not equally shared with GIs of color. And then racial covenants, even though they were technically outlawed in 1948, unfortunately with suburban developments like Levittown, why they may not have had legal racial covenants on the units, they weren't sold to African-American households, even those that had the income and the savings in order to buy, because the sellers, the developers, didn't want to upset white buyers. Next slide. So just a few years ago in Massachusetts, we were the 49th in the nation with a racial wealth gap. We had 31% of our households of color owning their homes, whereas white households we had 69%. And I think that D.C. was part of that, so I think it's 49 out of 51. Next. And all this has led to a significant racial wealth gap. So this is in the greater Boston area. This is the Color of Wealth report done by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. And it showed that the median net worth of white households in the greater Boston area, this is a few years ago, was $247,000. U.S. black households, only $8 of median net worth. Black Caribbean, $12,000. Puerto Rican, $3,000. So the disparity is huge. This isn't to say that homeownership is the only thing or the priority necessarily. It's to show that our policies and our programs have had dire consequences for many people in our community. And things like exclusionary zoning perpetuate longstanding discrimination. Next slide. This quote was came up by a legislator during the debate a few years ago about our transgender neighbors having access to bathrooms. It's the story that we like to tell about ourselves, that we are welcoming people, welcoming community, that everybody is welcome here. But the sad reality is that our land use policy doesn't always reflect that. At the same time, we've created it, so we can change it and we can improve it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. I'm going to turn it over to Andre, and also folks, if you have questions that are occurring to you as our panelists are presenting, feel free to drop them in the chat at the top of your screen. Thanks.
All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Andre LaRue. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance, and I hope now you're ready to implement some zoning and housing solutions. You heard from Karina and Shelley, the close relationship that climate action has to environmental justice, to combating sprawl, and to racial justice. They're all intimately entwined. Next slide. So the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance, if you're not familiar with us, is a coalition of 9 organizations that includes housing, environmental, design, planning, and public health organizations. Next slide. So when people talk about the American dream, they'll oftentimes, the classic image that comes to mind is the single-family house, the white picket fence in the suburbs. But I would venture to say that the American dream for many Americans has now changed. We see a huge market preference among young people and for downsizing boomers for the kind of scene that you see on the right, much more mixed use, diverse, vibrant, exciting kind of communities, walkable access to transit, restaurants, etc. Next slide. So, we need better housing choices for families and seniors, more vibrant, walkable downtowns, and thoughtful planning and development that protects us from a changing climate. This is really the kind of language that we need to be talking about in our communities in order to get better development, the kinds of development that will address all of the issues that you heard about earlier. The problem is our laws are way out of date. The last time we updated our planning, zoning, and permitting laws was back in 1975 at the state level. And what that means essentially is that we have 351 cities and towns that are all doing different things around land use, and we really rely on you at the local level to make these improvements. Next slide. And we talk about great neighborhoods when we talk about these issues with communities, because it's about not really making an intellectual argument, although you've heard a lot of data tonight. People don't generally change their minds or oftentimes change their minds based on that data. You really have to kind of grab them by the heartstrings. And what people understand about these issues is what makes a great neighborhood. And one fact I will point out to you is it seems very overwhelming to change zoning. Zoning can be a very controversial issue. You see it all the time, development fights in your communities, I'm sure. But the good news is that we don't have to fix everything. We don't have to do a huge comprehensive master plan. We don't have to do a complete rewrite of our zoning laws. And while those things are nice, and if your community can do it, great, go ahead. But we really just have to focus on those walkable, vibrant places in our communities, whether it's the village, the town center, the main street, a commercial area. You have some place in your community that you can turn into one of these walkable, vibrant areas. If you're in a very rural community, then, again, look to your villages or work regionally with your neighbors to see where there might be those kinds of places. So I'm going to look at a few tools right now. I'm not going to go into too much detail except for this first one. One of the low-hanging fruits that you can grab at the local level to start changing zoning and housing outcomes and creating affordable housing that's not necessarily subsidized and that doesn't change what your community and neighborhoods look like is accessory dwelling units. And so an accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, is a unit that is secondary to the primary home. So the way that these can work is that if you have a single-family home, you can carve out an affordable unit within the main structure or sometimes detached. So, for example, a garage conversion or maybe like a basement apartment or attic apartment. They're generally smaller. There's usually the homeowner is living in one of the units. Oftentimes you see older folks who need a caretaker or a family member living on site or an adult disabled child. The ADUs are wonderful solutions for all of these things and helping people age in place. Next slide. So this is just a couple of examples of what they can look like. On the left, it basically just looks like a single family home. The unit is completely inside the envelope of the home, so there's no external change to the neighborhood. The upper right shows either a garage conversion or maybe an addition with a a unit over a parking garage. Next slide. As I mentioned, ADUs matter because demographics are changing, right? Our family's changing. It's becoming more expensive to live. Housing is becoming more expensive, and we need to be more flexible about our existing housing stock and letting people solve their own housing problems, right? So we're seeing increased multi-generational housing situations. We see a lot of seniors who are maybe stranded in their large homes, don't necessarily want to take care of those homes, but don't have any apartments really in their community to downsize to. Giving them the flexibility to work out a creative arrangement with maybe a renter or with family members or caretakers is really important. Not to mention providing income which can help them deal with rising property taxes. Next slide. So who regulates ADUs? You do at the local level. It's municipally driven. As long as you are meeting the state building code requirements, your community can pass local laws that regulate the dimensions and look and et cetera of ADUs. Next slide. We have, at the Mass Smart Growth Alliance last year, we did an excellent report on accessory dwelling units. We had a researcher named Amy Dane. She looked at 100 cities and towns around Boston and what they were doing. So who is doing ADUs, how many units they're producing, who isn't, and made some recommendations and lessons learned about what practices, what characteristics of a local ordinance can get you a more effective ordinance and produce more units. So feel free to look that up on our website or Google it. Next slide. And we're seeing this as really a national trend because, communities don't necessarily have a lot of places to put big apartment buildings, or we know how difficult it is to permit those kinds of developments. So this is seen as a way that in single-family neighborhoods, we can add some more affordable units. And as we know, most of our communities are zoned for single-family housing, larger homes on larger lots, as the previous speaker said. And you know what? In Massachusetts, we tend to look at New Hampshire as being a very conservative state, but in this instance, they actually have a statewide law that allows accessory dwelling units in every community, and we have not gotten to that point yet. Next slide. So we do have some good examples here in Massachusetts, though, and we are seeing increasing number of communities that are looking at these, looking to adopt ADU ordinances. And I would say Newton, Lexington, Ipswich are a few. Newton just passed a couple of years ago an ordinance, a very good one, which over the first year, I think they had a previous ordinance which they got 4 or 5 maybe a year, and that went up to about 20 a year. So it was really not a lot of units spread around the community. It's barely noticeable, and yet it's a way, if every community did this, we could actually get a lot of units produced. Next slide. The next tool that I'm going to just mention very quickly is inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning, as Shelley mentioned, is when you have a market rate development of a certain size and a certain percentage of those units are required to be affordable at a level of area median income. So generally, to meet that affordability requirement, it has to be at least affordable to 80% of AMI or lower. Again, this is an easy, low-hanging fruit where if your community doesn't have an inclusionary zoning ordinance, you're missing out on opportunities to get some affordable units in your community. Next slide. An example, I live in the city of Medford, and we just this past year passed inclusionary zoning ordinance for the first time. And what it does in its simplest form is if you have a development over 10 units to 24 units, you can do 10%, and as the projects get bigger, the required amount of affordable housing goes up in steps as well. And you could be more sophisticated about this. You could take it to the next step. You could take a look proactively at your transit zones and perhaps create districts around those zones where you ramp up the inclusionary zoning. So as Karina mentioned, we want to keep people who are dependent on transit near transit, right, or else they can't use it. And so we need to have affordable housing in places that are close to public transportation. So what about doing things like increasing affordability requirements around mass transit stations, but in return to incentivize that, maybe reduce the parking requirements or streamlining those projects in other ways. Next slide. Another tool that has come up recently, the City of Cambridge has been discussing the possibility of doing an affordable housing overlay. So as we know, Cambridge, very expensive community. It's becoming kind of polarized at both ends of the economic spectrum. It invests a lot in subsidized housing, so you have low-income people, but you also have most of what the market is there is very high income, very expensive. So the thought is, let's make it easier and incentivize 100% affordable housing projects in our community by giving some density benefits to those projects if they could be 100% affordable. It was not passed this past session by the City Council. It needs to change zoning in Massachusetts. You need a supermajority or 2/3 in most communities. And Cambridge, there was basically a majority, 5 out of 9 counselors. They needed 6 out of 9, so they're going to take another shot at that in the next few months. But this is something that folks in Medford, for example, my community, are interested in looking at. Might be an interesting tool for some others. Next slide. Friendly 40Bs. Now, I'm sure many of you in the environmental community feel that 40B is a bad word, and I understand why, because sometimes these 40Bs are large developments in locations that you may not want them. And communities have a history of kind of discouraging development in their town centers, at least significant development. So unfortunately, developers go to places where they can buy big tracts of land, which tends to be at the outskirts of town, could be like farms or open space, and that's where they put their big projects. So what we recommend to communities is don't be reactive, be proactive, get in front of it, work with developers to find suitable locations for 40B projects and turn it into a benefit for your community. And that's exactly what the town of Easton did. This is a beautiful, friendly 40B project. It combined historic preservation of the old Shovel Works mill complex there with fantastic affordability. So you can do both of these things. And as a result, Easton was able to, this and other projects, increase their number much closer to the 10%. They're just about at 10% right now. Next slide.
And just a heads up, Andre, we are about at time. I know we had some technical setbacks earlier, but if you could maybe wrap up in the next 3-4 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, will do. There's also 40R districts, again, another way of being proactive and getting some zoning in specific areas where you get some state incentive payments for. Next slide. Industrial parks, we're seeing this as a way of introducing housing to job centers. Next slide. Pocket neighborhoods and cottage types of developments, a wonderful way of getting kind of dense, smaller single-family homes around open space. Next slide. And as some of you know, there's the governor has filed a housing choice legislation, which would, for some of these best practices that I've mentioned and some others, would make it easier for communities to adopt them by lowering the required vote from a supermajority down to a simple majority for these things that communities are trying to do. Next slide. And I just want to end the last minute or so with a couple words about how to organize. It's really important, I think, for housing advocates, transportation advocates, and climate activists to work together. But generally, even at the local level, even if folks are active, they don't have those connections. So we recommend doing that. Public health folks as well, age-friendly folks. Next slide. And there's messaging. We have a website called Great Neighborhoods, and you can see that whether you're in a small community, a large community, urban, rural, suburban, there are certain messages that really resonate with people everywhere. Next slide. You can also show people visually, I think, what density looks like, because density tends to be a bad word, but 8 units per acre, 12 units per acre, even 20 units per acre, doesn't have to feel like a big apartment block. Can be, with good design, a very wonderful community. Next slide. We also, on our Great Neighborhoods website, have some infographics that you can share on social media. So we're trying to build out tools for local activists. Next slide. It's another example. Next slide. This is a website of there's a picture of the website. So www.great-neighborhoods.org. Feel free to go there, get more information. Next slide. The storytelling, putting a human face on these issues, really important. So we recommend, as you work on these campaigns locally, that you really have people tell their stories that makes these issues real for folks. Next slide. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andre. Sorry to cut your presentation short, but I think that everyone gained a lot of really valuable tools to be implemented on the local level. Which brings me to next steps. So unfortunately, because we are at 8 o'clock and I want to be respectful of our panelists' time, we are going to skip over the chat Q&A portion of this webinar. If folks have questions that they would like to see answered, though, I would absolutely encourage you to email me. My email will be on the next slide, and I can pass them along to our expert panelists. So really quickly, I want to give us a couple other action items. I think Andre spoke really well about different local action strategies that we can take, as did Shelley and Karina. And one other quick update is that we're going to be having two more parts to our Affordable Housing as a Climate Solution series. And then I want to briefly touch on a state action that you guys can all take this week, actually. So there is a net zero stretch code sign-on letter circulating in the State House, and if you are able to call your rep and ask them to join it, it will be going to the governor at the end of the week. And it gives a clear signal that we care about addressing both the housing and the climate crises by encouraging more net zero buildings. So again, here is my email address, and I want to, again, give a shout out to our partners at Smart Growth Alliance and LISC, as well as our incredible panelists, Karina, Shelley, and Andre. Thank you all so much. And thanks to everyone who joined tonight. I will be sending out a recording of the webinar, as well as all of the slides tomorrow, as well as other resources that we can use to help create more affordable housing in our communities. So thanks everyone for being here tonight, and I hope that you have a great rest of your evening.